Three, that was outstanding. Man, get another strike in the same spot.
This is the story of one of the most unique squadrons in the history of naval aviation, the Black Ponies. The Mekong River begins its 2,500-mile quest for the South China Sea in northern Tibet as the melting mountain snows transform themselves into the river system known as the Mekong. The river flows south from China, separating Burma from Laos. It cuts a swath through the jungle as it transverses Cambodia and begins to branch out as it crosses the border of Vietnam into the Song Tien Giang Upper River and the Song Hoa Giang, or Lower River. The two branches of the Mekong spread themselves out and shape the wide, flat, expansive tropical savanna of the Mekong River Delta. The upper river splits into the Mito, Ham Long, and Cochin branches. The lower river, only a few miles separated from its kin, is known by its French name, the Bassac River. These four branches, flowing parallel, divide again just before reaching the end of their journey. So much soil is transported that the once crystal-clear water turns a rich red-brown as it pours its silt, sediment, and soul into the gray-green sea from its 8 mouths. The Vietnamese call the entire system Cue Long Giang, the river of the 9 dragons, adding one more imaginary mouth for good luck. The Mekong River Delta was one of the most strategically important areas of the Republic of South Vietnam. Along the western, or Gulf of Thailand coast, dense, dark forest formed a demarcation between what the government of South Vietnam on a good day, but not at night, might try to lay claim to, and what was indisputably controlled by the enemy. Between the sylvan thicket of tram and duoc trees and the warm waters of the Gulf, mangrove forests grew haphazardly along the coastal swamplands, alternating as a giant patchwork in a give and take between man and nature, with small fishing villages and settlements. This is a land that is exotic to most Westerners and home to tigers, leopards, panthers, wild boars, mongooses, pythons, gibbons, and rhesus monkeys. The Vietnamese, under the French colonial rule, built in the delta a system of canals, one of the most intricate and elaborate inland waterways in the world. Only one paved highway transverses the region, and most of the commerce took place on canals, streams, and rivers, as rice made its way to the major waterways leading to Saigon. The Delta was home to more than half of the country's population, and 80% of its rice crop was harvested there. Much of the rice grew in the floating rice region between the forests of the northwest and the mouths of the Mekong to the southeast, between the Cambodian border on the north and Can Tho on the south, the largest town in the Delta. Despite more than a decade of low-intensity guerrilla warfare, South Vietnam in 1964 was one of the world's major rice exporters. But the amount of rice available to the government fell by 25% between 1965 and 1966, as the Viet Cong increased their control over the Mekong Delta. By 1967, South Vietnam imported almost 1 million tons of rice, as the Delta became virtually an enemy stronghold, providing rice, taxes, and recruits for the Viet Cong war effort. Until 1965, the U.S. Navy had a small number of advisors in Vietnam. In order to control the infiltration of VC craft from among the 50,000 civilian boats operating in the coastal waters, and to prevent the 25 known enemy steel-hulled trawlers from shipping weapons and ammunition into the Delta, the Navy began Operation Market Time in July 1965, a year after the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and organized it under Task Force 115. The world's greatest open-ocean blue-water naval power had to create a brown-water navy, complete with boats, strategy, tactics, and trained men almost overnight. Scores of PCF Swift boats, built from commercially available hulls in a very short time, especially for this mission, joined 17 82-foot Coast Guard cutters known as WPBs, and several LSTs that anchored off the Mekong River and other major waterways. As the need grew to run patrols closer inshore and into the shallow rivers and canals to deny the enemy their free use, another operation called Game Warden began in December 1965 as Task Force 116. Again, the Navy had no suitable boats for the task, so it turned once more to a commercially available fiberglass hull, this one 32 feet in length. Military contractors added a naval superstructure with 2 sheets of armor plating along the sides of the afterdeck and the cockpit. The Navy thus quickly came up with a 30-knot craft that drew only 9 to 18 inches of water, propelled as it was by jacuzzi-designed water jets instead of propellers, and powered by 2 220 horsepower diesels, just what was needed for the shallow inland waterways of the Delta. The Navy mounted twin 50 caliber machine guns on the bow and a single 50 on the stern. These Mark I and Mark II river patrol boats, called PBRs, brought brown water naval operations into the Delta in 1966. During Game Warden, the Navy quickly realized the need for air support. While aircraft carriers were occasionally stationed off the coast of South Vietnam on Dixie Station, their fast-moving jets with limited loiter capability were not effective for close air support in this environment. Something else was needed. When gas turbine-powered helicopters replaced the older generation of piston-engine choppers, their introduction into Vietnam in the mid-1960s would revolutionize the way Americans conducted warfare. Their increased speed, range, reliability, payload, and firepower gave U.S. ground forces a flexibility and maneuverability that forever altered battle tactics. Having no attack helicopters, the Navy initially borrowed UH-1B helicopters from the Army, which then trained Navy crews until the Navy could develop its own attack helicopter capability. In June 1967, the Navy commissioned Helicopter Light Attack Squadron 3, nicknamed Seawolves, to operate in detachments throughout the Delta. In order to seize the initiative to take the fight to the enemy, the Army and the Navy formed a joint operation in July 1966 called Mobile Riverine Force. It began operations in the Mekong River Delta and the adjacent Rung Sat Special Zone just below Saigon in January of 1967. American forces developed an approach that was both new and old. By employing the same tactics that were used in the Seminole and Civil Wars, they deployed by boat highly mobile Army units throughout the inland waterways. The Navy's contribution, Task Force 117, began with a large fleet of LST hulls converted to barracks and repair vessels, shallow draft landing ships or LCMs converted into tango boats, Zippos, and supporting BBRs. Eventually, the force evolved into assault patrol or alpha boats, built specifically for this mission. But the Navy's role never amounted to more than a sort of transportation and escort service for the Army's 9th Division, as Admiral Emil Zumwalt later described it. Many in positions of leadership felt the Navy could be used more suitably. In September of 1968, just prior to assuming command of the naval forces in Vietnam, or COMNAV-4V, Admiral Zumwalt met with Captain Robert Salzer, Commander Task Force 117. Salzer told Zumwalt that the search and destroy mission was losing its effectiveness and recommended a more aggressive role for the 38,000-man Navy force in country. Zumwalt knew that market time provided an effective water and air barrier against infiltration by sea, and Game Warden, with reasonable effectiveness, denied the enemy unrestricted access to the major rivers. But the enemy still commanded uninhibited use of the small waterways. Zumwalt often sent his staff unorthodox proposals headed with the large capital letters ZWI, Zumwalt's wild idea. His staff at COMNAV-4V knew that Cambodia had become a major enemy supply area and that only an aggressive campaign on the small waterways could impose a barrier between this supply area and the enemy units in the Delta. What began as a ZWI became a new strategy in November 1968 named Sea Lords, the acronym for Southeast Asia Lake, Oceans, River, and Delta Strategy. It aimed to close off the water routes from Cambodia. Captain Salzer became First Sea Lord, commander of Task Force 194, serving until December 1968. The Navy would take the initiative by conducting operations in 3 areas. First, naval forces created a barrier along the major canals in the upper delta stretching the entire length of the Cambodian border from the Gulf of Thailand to the area just west of Saigon known as the Parrot's Beak. Second, to seize control of the U Minh forest in the southwest part of the delta. And third, to win back the Nam Can area of the Kamau Peninsula, the Navy aggressively dispatched forces into areas where little Allied presence existed. COMNAV-4V made many game warden and maritime craft available to the new operation. As the mobile riverine force became Vietnamized and operations drew to a close in June 1969, the Navy also transferred some of those assets to Sea Lords. Zumwalt's staff at COMNAV-4V realized the need to greatly increase air support for Sea Lords and decided in late 1968 to augment the helicopters of VAL-3 with a fixed-wing attack squadron stationed in the Delta. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt greatly influenced the development of the Navy's role in Vietnam as Commander Naval Forces and later Chief of Naval Operations. He is quoted as having said, "Conducting riverine brown-water warfare requires ingenuity and improvisation. There's no body of accepted doctrine on the subject. The Naval Academy does not offer courses in it. Indeed, there's little empirical experience from previous wars to draw upon. You have to make up riverine warfare as you go along." His remarks aptly apply to the Black Ponies, who made up the air power component of riverine warfare as they went along, improvising an aircraft and using ingenuity to develop the tactics that would get the job done. When Zumwalt and his planners decided the Brown-Water Navy needed a fixed-wing attack squadron for close air support, they indeed found few resources to draw upon. Plans were made to use the Pilatus Porter, built under license by Fairchild under the OV-12A designation. It would have carried side-mounted Gatling or miniguns. The Navy canceled the contract for 20 of these planes and instead transferred 18 of the Marine Corps' 96 recently acquired OB-10 Broncos. 29 years later, at the 1997 Black Pony reunion, plank owner Fred Herring recalled,
Take it one step back earlier than that, Don,
Okay.
and had the original plan gone ahead, we would have been a completely different squadron because I was in a squadron that was in transition, different type of aircraft, and they decided they didn't have enough time, so they made me available. My detailer was cutting orders for me to go back to Maryland to check out in the helioporter that the Navy was buying to supplement the helicopter squadron in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And we were going to do it with side-mounted 50s with this little single-engine jobby. President Johnson was having his trouble with Congress at that time. Someone in Congress discovered that the Department of Defense hadn't competitively bid for those planes, and a ruckus came up anyway. So they dropped that plan, but of course they still needed this type of help in Vietnam. So that's when they shifted gears, and thank God, got the OB-10s.
Good.
North American Rockwell built the OB-10 in response to the Defense Department's request for an aircraft for counterinsurgency operations. A 1962 Marine Corps study originally identified the need, and the Marines became the first to take delivery of the Bronco in 1968, followed by the Air Force shortly thereafter. While the Air Force and the Marines used the aircraft for forward air control, observation, and naval gunfire support, the Navy deployed it as an attack aircraft. The OB-10, with its distinctive twin boom and 40-foot wingspan, looked somewhat like the World War II P-38 Lightning. 3/4 the size of the P-38, yet with half the horsepower, the Bronco also had 3/4 of the Lightning's performance when it wasn't carrying a load. Operating at the weights the Black Ponies did, however, their OB-10s were able to get over 200 knots only when the nose was pointed at the ground. If an aircraft is to operate at low altitude over hostile jungles, it needs to be maneuverable, and strong enough to withstand the G-forces encountered when the pilot yanks and banks the plane to evade enemy ground fire. Rockwell designers stressed the Bronco to 7 G-forces for pulling off target and evading anti-aircraft fire, a force which might pull the wings off a less sturdily built plane. The fuselage began with a small nose that immediately flared into a large, bulbous canopy that curved around the pilots in a way that afforded excellent visibility of the ground, and came to an abrupt Manx tail-like end behind the tandem seats with a small cargo bay that could carry 3 parachutists. A shoulder-mounted wing with squared-off tips afforded high lift for maneuverability at low speeds. Attached to it were racks for missiles or rockets. Below the fuselage, 2 sponsons protruded, which housed 4 M60 7.62 mm or 30 caliber machine guns, and provided the hardpoints from which more weapon pods were slung. These pods contained 30 cal Gatling guns, 20 mm cannons, or rockets. Black Ponies usually carried 4 pods of rockets, or, if carrying a 20 mm gun pod on the center line, 3. The squadron used 2 types of rockets, or forward-firing ordnance: the 5-inch Zuni and the 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets. The usual weapons load consisted of 3 pods of 4 Zuni rockets and 1 pod of 19 2.75-inch rockets underneath, and 2 Zunis on each wing. The Zuni is a supersonic, unguided rocket designed to be fired at ground targets, although it had been used to shoot down a MiG over North Vietnam. 15 feet long, 5 inches in diameter, with a high explosive warhead, the Zuni packed an impressive wallop. Since this was the era before widespread use of smart weapons, the Zuni's accuracy depended entirely on the skills and marksmanship of the pilot. Because the Zuni lacked the smarts to guide itself to the target, the pilot had to maneuver the aircraft to the precise spot in the sky where, at the right airspeed, dive angle, and G-force, he could shoot the rocket at the target and expect to hit it. The Bronco also lacked the smarts, computers, and other gadgets to help the pilot get to that precise spot in the sky. Instead, the Black Pony pilot used airmanship, visual cues, training, experience, and seat-of-the-pants instinct. The aircraft had simple systems, mechanical flight controls instead of hydraulics, for example. Just what was needed in a guerrilla war where an arrow shot from a bow was known to have brought down its prey when it penetrated the bird's hydraulic arteries and the helo bled itself out of control. Besides being underpowered, the main criticism the Bronco's pilots would level at it was that it did not have an air conditioning system. In fact, the OB-10 had an inadequate ventilation system, an amazing oversight considering the climates in which it was likely to be used. The Bronco was not a pretty bird, but it did have a functional charm that grew on its pilots and mechanics. At first painted green to blend in with the terrain, they were repainted in 1971 a gull gray-white with the rationale that the main threat came from the ground and eyes pointed upward. The number of bullet holes, in fact, did diminish after that. 4 Navy pilots, Fred Herring, Al Shower, Pete Russell, and Bob Stoddard, reported to Camp Pendleton in late 1968, where the Marines transitioned them to the Bronco. They returned to VS-41 at NAS North Island, San Diego, where they trained the first RAG instructors, Steve Chappell, Fritz Lynch, and Dean Davis. The prospective first commanding officer, Commander Gil Winans, reported aboard VS-41, which hosted the RAG in October 1968. The first pilots primarily came from the anti-submarine warfare, early warning, and prop and jet attack communities. Joining Gil Winans and the first XO, Commander Marty Schumann, were plank owners ZZ Zagorts, Fred Herring, Don Florco, Ron Ballard, Al Shower, John Butterfield, William Bartlett, Jerry Goodman, Pete Russell, Jerry Wheeler, Art Savard, W.J. Flash Levern, who was later killed in a training accident at North Island, Bob Stoddard, Charlie Sapp, Gary Rousseau, Aubrey Martin, Barry Fry, Dan Conrad, Mick Brennan, Bill Robertson, Bob Campbell, Jim Chadwick, Peter Dunn, Dave Edwards, Glenn Ewing, Jeffrey Johnson, Mike Kersey, Richard Pratt, Mike Quinlan, Dan Sheehan, Roy Sickink, Denny Bennett, Jim Breasted, and Gunnar Mason. 2 months after commissioning ceremonies at North Island on January 3, 1969, these 36 officers and 110 enlisted men arrived at Binh Thuy, Republic of Vietnam, for a short, intensive, in-country training period. They would call themselves the Black Ponies. With an average onboard count of 4 airplanes and 5 instructors, the OV-10 RAG trained 97 replacement pilots and 422 maintenance personnel before it closed up shop in February 1972. Replacement pilots received 25 hours of ground training and 75 hours in the air during the 16-week syllabus. The first week was devoted to learning aircraft systems before starting the 10-week flight syllabus, which culminated with a 3-week weapons detachment at Marine Corps Air Station, Yuma, Arizona. Replacement pilots then returned to North Island for 1 week of tactics, during which time they pulled together everything they learned in a simulated close air support mission at Camp Pendleton. Finally, before leaving for Vietnam, each replacement pilot underwent 3 weeks of survival, escape, and resistance training, and usually a PBR orientation. Light Attack Squadron 4's mission was to provide air support for the River Patrol forces in the Mekong Delta and the adjacent Rung Sat Special Zone, including support for SEAL operations and Vietnamese armed forces. The squadron was divided into 2 operating detachments, Det Bravo, operating out of the Army Airfield at Vung Tau, and Det Alpha at Binh Thuy. Det Bravo at Vung Tau supported operations in the northern and eastern portions of the Delta, including the Vam Co Tay and the Vam Co Dong rivers, Operation Giant Slingshot, and the vital Long Tau shipping channel, transiting 45 miles of the Rung Sat Special Zone from the South China Sea to Saigon. Gil Winans, the first Black Pony skipper, recalls 30 years later why Vung Tau was chosen for a VAL-4 detachment.
The ship canal, see, that's the beginning or the end, depending on which way you're going, to heavy shipping into Saigon. And they were taking a lot of rocket hits coming up through that channel, and they wanted to have a little safer passage. At any of the 20 to 30 ships anchored off Vung Tau, waiting to go up to Saigon and offload, which was the main port was in Saigon. And they jumped through the Rung Sat Special Zone, and it was ideal for anybody with a rocket launcher, a B-40 rocket launcher, could get really close to the ships and harass them as they're going to and fro.
Under the Military Assistance Program, U.S. contractors built a Vietnamese Air Force base at Binh Thuy on a swamp adjacent to the Ba Sac River. Premier Key dedicated it in June 1966. Initially, the VNAV and the U.S. Air Force jointly used the base, but by 1971, VAL-4 was the only American unit flying from the field. While the Black Ponies were to find it adequate to their task, Much of the airfield construction was substandard or in acknowledged violation of safety criteria, as they would apply to an airfield built anywhere in the U.S. or anywhere else outside a war zone. The single runway, designated 624, was 100 feet wide and 6,000 feet long, with 500-foot overruns. In deviation from safety standards, the runway's centerline was only 360 feet from the edge of the single parallel 50-foot wide taxiway, which connected to the runway with two crosswind taxiways. The asphalt east parking apron adjacent to the control tower was the home of the two Vietnamese Air Force A-37 Dragonfly squadrons, the 520th and the 526th of the 74th Tactical Wing, and the O-1 Bird Dog and U-17 spotter planes of the 116th and 122nd. The west parking apron was constructed of pierced steel planking, or PSP. On the west end of this apron, VNAV Huey helicopters of the 211th and the 217th Helo squadrons sat between low protective walls, adjacent to the revetments that surrounded VAL-4's OV-10s. Black Pony officers and enlisted men lived at Navy Binh Thuy, a mile and a half south of the Vietnamese Air Force Base. Navy Binh Thuy was separated by the road that led to Can Tho, 3 miles further south. On the east side of the road lay the Naval Support Facility, the Brownwater Navy Boat Base, adjacent to the Bossack. Black Ponies lived at the Tactical Air Support Facility on the west side of the road, along with the main detachment of Seawolves. Adjacent to hooches, enlisted and officers' quarters, were the squadron's administrative spaces, chow hall, and dispensary. VAL-4 pilots occasionally took off from and landed Broncos on 0321, the short runway used by helos, and taxied them to the hangar next to the admin building for intermediate maintenance. In the beginning, Black Ponies flew 3 types of missions: armed patrols, overhead air cover, and quick reaction scrambles. While on patrol, a 2-aircraft light attack fire team would conduct visual reconnaissance and check for targets of opportunity with the various naval operation centers on the patrol route. For air cover operations, an external fuel tank was added on the centerline, allowing the Black Pony fire team 4 to 5 hours of on-station coverage over the patrol boats transiting the waterways of the Delta. Each detachment also maintained a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week scramble alert crew of 2 aircraft and 4 pilots. The bunker at Binh Thuy that housed the scramble crew had a World War I feel to it, encased as it was with huge timbers and concrete. The scramble crews launched when friendly forces required immediate assistance and could have wheels in the well within 6 minutes of a call. The OV-10 was the only tactical strike aircraft used in Vietnam that was authorized to place an airstrike without a forward air controller. During the spring and summer of 1969, Black Ponies developed close air support tactics that had not been seen since the Second World War in Korea. Initially, losses were heavy. On May 23rd, Lieutenant Pete Russell was killed in action and his aircraft flown back to base from the rear seat by Jeff Johnson. On July 19th, Lieutenant Aubrey Martin and Lieutenant J.G. Roy Sinkink were killed in action when their Bronco was shot down. New replacement pilots began arriving. Commander Burl Klein, the new XO, Jerry Mahoney, Pete Ford, Vernon Rosenberger, Charlie Fail, Mike Wolf, T.Y. Baker, Mark Byers, Bill Robb, Dean Davis, Joel Sandberg, and Larry Hone. In a change of command on September 6th, Marty Schumann relieved Gil Winans. In October of 1969, just 6 months after arriving in country, this one squadron killed more enemy troops and destroyed more enemy structures and waterborne craft than the rest of the 7th Fleet squadrons combined. But success came with an increasingly heavy price. On December 20th, Lieutenant Joel Sandberg and his Marine observer, Captain Carl Long, were killed in action when their Bronco was brought down by the enemy over the Rung Sat. At the 1997 Black Pony reunion, Fred Herring and John Butterfield recalled the loss.
The only mission that we did was single plane,
Yeah.
and it was at low altitude, 500 feet as I remember,
Right.
below, and very slow. And so you were kind of like a sitting duck out there,
Yeah.
where anybody wanted to shoot at you.
What had happened is we had an aircraft that was on patrol in the Rungsat Special Zone, which was, you know, notorious for having bad guys, the Viet Cong, and they were trying to keep the shipping from going from Vung Tau, which was the major port, into Saigon. And so they were, you know, periodically, you know, mining and bombing and trying to sabotage ships and keep them from bringing supplies and keeping the waterways open up to Saigon. And
As 1969 drew to a close, new replacement pilots reported aboard. John Westerman, Jimmy Hanks, Jim Montgomery, Butch Underkoffler, Larry Lawton, Bill Dobbs, Ross Hanover, Devin Burke, Jim Bohanna, and Graham Forsythe. 1970 brought even more changes to operations in the Delta. The Navy deactivated Task Force 194 in June 1970 and transferred the Sea Lord's operations still under U.S. command to Task Force 116. The rest of the operations they transferred to the Vietnamese as part of the ACTIV program. Admiral Zumwalt coined the acronym, which stood for Accelerated Turnover to Vietnam, hoping to give the program a sense of action and purpose. The press would dub it, and the public would know it as part of the Vietnamization program. The Black Ponies found themselves flying fewer boat cover missions when the Vietnamese Navy went out on fewer operations. But single aircraft recon missions over the Rungsat continued. In a change of command ceremony, Commander Verl Klein relieved Marty Schumann as skipper on March 5th. 27 years later, Marty Schumann would recall his tour as Black Pony skipper.
It was a wonderful year for me. I became the CO after Gil left, and in 32 years of the Navy, my tour with VAL-4 was, I would consider, the highlight of my career. As I said, not because it was a great thing, a great aircraft, but the personnel. All the pilots, all the enlisted men were just eager guys wanting to do everything. They wanted to volunteer for everything, and it was one of the most enjoyable year that I've spent in my entire life.
In the spring of 1970, farewells were offered to departing plank owners who in turn hailed the new XO, Commander Len Roush, and new replacement pilots, Jerry Barton, Richard Merklin, John Thomas, Mike Monaghan, Ray Kellett, Jim Falls, Jim Hardy, Ray Button, John McCauley, John Meadows, Ed Madden, Ed Sullivan, Tom McCracken, Ron Bealey, Tim Sikorsky, Tom Bailey, and Randy Wyatt. Black Ponies flew extensive air support for the Cambodian incursion during April and May. In support of ground troops in the vicinity of Tat Son, Chadok Province on April 1st, Lieutenant Commander John Westerman and Lieutenant J.G. Pete Ford were wounded in action when their Bronco was shot down by the enemy. Both pilots ejected safely and were rescued. More replacement pilots joined VAL-4. Pete Walter, Mick McCullum, Charlie Moore, Don Hawkins, Bob Scholl, Ed Bastarach, Jerry Beaver, Bruce Turner, John Onchman, and Al Mazzaros. Enemy infiltration through the Parrot's Beak increased throughout 1970, and North Vietnamese regulars joined Viet Cong battalions like those operating in Din Tuong province that attacked outposts and riverine forces. In support of Allied ground troops in this area near Kai Bay on June 7th, Lieutenant Commander Jerry Barton was killed in action, and Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Hanks was wounded in action when their Bronco was brought down by hostile ground fire. On July 21st, the Vung Tau detachment ceased operations and all Black Pony assets were consolidated at Binh Thuy. By September 1970, the ACTOV program was well underway and few U.S. brown water naval assets remained in country. VAL-4 was being used mainly as an airborne quick reaction force. Commander Len Rausch assumed command of the Black Ponies on September 3rd, and the new XO, Commander Jim Burton, was joined by replacement pilots John Smalling, Bob Hurley, Bob White, Tom Langston, Ken Williams, Jim Becker, Lynn Hennish, Howard Hotchkiss, Mike Lamberto, and Sam Chips. Also joining the squadron were Sam Fleming and Galen Hall in the maintenance department and Flight Surgeon Larry Getz. Pete Ford survived a second ejection from a crippled Bronco when he and pilot Ed Bastrach were brought down by enemy fire near Thuy Nhan in Ken Tuong Province on September 29th. As 1970 drew to a close, events in the Delta would dramatically change VAL-4's mission. They began on December 1st when Vietnamese forces launched Operation Trung An Dao 17 in the infamous Forest of Darkness, the U-Min. The South Vietnamese government had abandoned the U-Min, in part because the terrain made military operations by the government so difficult. This heavily foliated area along the western or Gulf of Thailand coast of the Mekong Delta was covered by a foot or more of water at least 8 months of the year. Elephant grass grew 6 to 8 feet high among the trees. Numerous winding streams and waterways connected grid-like with geometric straight canals that averaged 3 feet in depth. Stagnant marshlands and occasional savannas interspersed the area. The U-Min had a reputation grounded in folklore, like the Okefenokee Swamp or the Everglades, only going back more than a millennium. For years, the enemy effectively owned the U-Min, and it became the political and military nerve center of the Viet Cong organization in the Mekong Delta, and the headquarters of the COSVIN, that's the Communist Party in Military Region 3. From their U-Min stronghold, 1/6 of South Vietnam's population and its most important food-producing region were within the enemy's grasp. The first phase of the U-Min campaign began in December 1970 with the strategy to establish 3 major fire support bases for operations of the 21st ARVN Division's 3 regiments, the 31st, the 32nd, and the 33rd. Each base possessed 105mm and 155mm howitzer batteries. Each depended on helicopters and boat convoys for resupply because the only dry land was canal and paddy dikes, or what was built up by soldiers out of the mud. The intrusion of the ARVN into their previously secure forest domain obviously alarmed the Viet Cong and the NVA, and the audacity of the ARVN to build permanent forts elicited a predictably violent response. The fire bases became the targets of a steady stream of assaults. The pattern was usually the same. A rocket or mortar barrage would surprise the base defenders, which the enemy hoped would demoralize them. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army soldiers could sneak a devastating array of firepower up to the perimeter of an ARVN forward fire base. After a mortar or a B-40 rocket barrage, oftentimes the enemy would launch a diversionary attack and then send in sappers as human bombs. Armed with explosives, the sappers would run up to the accordion wires surrounding the base perimeter and fall on it, and then detonate their charges, opening a hole for their comrades to run through. Many such assaults took place in the first several months of the U-Min campaign. Black Ponies found themselves flying numerous scramble missions in support of these fire bases and the Vietnamese Navy boat convoys that resupplied them. When 1970 came to a close, the Black Ponies had flown 7,354 sorties, logging 15,268 combat hours. More than 94% of all missions were now being flown in support of ARVN units in varying degrees of contact with the enemy forces. The Black Ponies had earned a reputation of being one of the most effective air units in the war. By mid-1971, for all intents and purposes, VAL-4 no longer was performing its original mission. New replacement pilots joined the Black Ponies in early 1971. Mike Despain, Max Britton, Joe Keller, Hal Smith, Ray Morris, and the new commanding officer, Bob Porter, who assumed command on March 3rd. 26 years later, Len Roush would recall his tour as Black Pony skipper.
I'm Len Roush, and I was fortunate enough to command Light Attack Squadron 4 from March of 70 to March of 71. And, well, not really. I was XO and then CO. So, but in that period, which was really in the middle of the history of Light Attack Squadron 4, there was a significant change in the Delta where we supported the Riverine Warfare Group. Because when I came aboard, we had just started the Vietnamization of the Riverine Warfare Group. And so rather than supporting, for about 6 months, we supported U.S. manned patrol boats, we ended up with the last 6 months supporting Vietnamese manned patrol boats. And I guess the most significant thing is that we saw the results of the people ahead of us, because when my first flight flew over the Delta, it was pretty black and dark, and there were very few lights. And by the time I left a year later, there were many lights in many villages, and the canals were open, and it was a much more easier commerce in that Delta as a result of not only just the Black Ponies, but the helicopter squadrons and the ARVN forces themselves, who had really made a difference in the Delta. I was surprised, I think, mostly about Light Attack Squadron 4 in that the average age, even in spite of me being 44 years old when I commanded that squadron, the average age was about 20 years old, maybe 19 and 9 months. And that meant that the people who maintained the airplanes were young men who became leaders in our Navy, and the pilots were young men who became leaders in the community and in the Navy. And it was a pleasure for me to serve with those that were with me in Vietnam, and I couldn't have asked for a better squadron.
Black Ponies worked increasingly with U.S. aircraft packs as the battle for the U Minh forest developed. During one 12-hour period, the enemy shot down 5 Army helos, and Black Ponies provided close air support for the rescue of the crews. On April 5th, Lieutenant Hotch Hotchkiss was wounded in action, but flew the aircraft back to base and landed safely. As the monsoon rains increased in the spring, so did enemy infiltration and resupply efforts. On April 11th, CTF 116 scrambled a Black Pony fire team to assist CTF 115 market time forces, who were in pursuit of an NVA SL-8 trawler. Upon clearance to fire on the trawler, which had been engaged in a running sea battle with 4 U.S. Navy market time vessels and 2 Vietnamese gunboats, the Ponies, led by Lieutenant Bruce Turner, conducted a series of rocket attacks. The Black Ponies received intense radar-guided 23mm anti-aircraft fire, as well as 51 cal and small arms fire. Wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Ed Bastrach, recently recalled the events of that night.
So it was dark. It was at night. The first thing that struck us when we got to the target is we flew out at our normal altitude for hitting a target, and Bruce, we went lights out, and Bruce rolled in. And what made the experience so unique, and after 300 or so combat missions, I'd never seen anything like this. The entire sky lit up. We were taking gunfire on most of our combat missions, but very few of the people we were taking fire from would use tracers, therefore telegraphing where their sight was. And what made this unique was multiple color tracers from different caliber guns. And Charlie might not appreciate my saying this, but it's the only flight I was ever on where the person in my back seat literally lowered his seat so he could hide behind me. And when Bruce pulled off the target, he on the first pass didn't hit anything, so he took a lot of fire going down and going off. And I said, Charlie, I can't believe he's not down, because we were radar-mounted guns, and we didn't have radar jamming kind of equipment. It was heavy caliber gun. And fortunately for us, as we rolled in, Charlie and I talked it through, and we decided to go with VT fused Zunis. And because we rolled in at a normal height, and it was a pretty big ship, I mean, it wasn't like a sampan we were trying to hit. We did not do enough damage to sink it on the first run, but the VT fused Zunis, I was lucky enough to run 4 of them from the bow to the stern, and we took out, I think, most of the guns, or a good many of them, because truthfully, as we went down to the ship, taking fire any other flight, you knew you were taking it, but you didn't see it. And this was like driving at 1,000,000 miles an hour through Las Vegas. I mean, there were just different color traces flying by us. And I truly thought when we pulled off the target that they'd get us.
This would turn out to be the first steel-hulled, ocean-going vessel sunk by U.S. air power since the Second World War. Replacement pilots J.K. Pell, Neil Salmi, Steve Saltzman, Steve Chappell, Roy Bubba Seegers, Mark Pyle, D.K. Sheldon, Ben LaBalbo, George Lever, and the new flight surgeon, Steve Rogers, reported aboard. ComNav 4V turned over Solid Anchor, the last American operation, to the Vietnamese Navy in April 1971, ending U.S. Navy operations in South Vietnam, except for a small number of advisors, VAL-3 and VAL-4. VAL-4 ceased flying Trung Anh Dao patrols on July 21st. The first phase of the U Minh campaign ended, by government decree, 3 weeks after the Black Ponies sunk the trawler, which had been trying to resupply enemy units in the area. May 1st, 1971, might have been an arbitrary date, but proved convenient for political ceremonies when President Thuy visited the Rang Dong Fire Base, home of the 33rd Regiment. The worst fighting in the U Minh and the Delta was yet to come, however, and VAL-4's mission would evolve even more into one of providing close air support to troops in contact with the enemy. Total Navy personnel in country at the beginning of 1971 amounted to only 1/3 of the 1968 peak of 38,000. A few months later, when it came time to pull more Navy units out of Vietnam, logic was on the side of ComNav 4V deactivating VAL-4. However, because of a turn of events in the Delta in 1971, and unusual changes taking place within the Black Ponies, pressure was being exerted from the field all the way up to General Creighton Abrams, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, to keep the Black Ponies in the Delta. The way the Black Ponies performed close air support gave the squadron a new lease on life. Flying close air support like it had not been done since Korea and World War II, VAL-4 worked as effectively with the Army as its own helicopter attack units did. New replacement pilots Jay Schoenfeld, Jim Arthur, Ad Clark, Kit Lavelle, Tony Colantoni, Lyle Anvik, Pete Wiley, and Jim Bumford reported aboard in time for the peak fighting in the U Minh campaign. From September 4th to September 22nd, Black Ponies flew 218 sorties in support of the 21st ARVN Division and its American advisor.
uniform. Uniform 23-6 is headed to your AO scramble. And we have the information on your scramble. This is uniform, Roger. Try to contact uniform 65. I say again, uniform 65, and he can give you a sit rep, over. Roger, sir. Break. Uniform 65. Uniform 65. Black Pony 836. Uniform is Pony 36. Say again, sir. Roger, Pony 36. This is uniform. The TIC is approximate coordinates X-ray Sierra 015114. If you were en route to that area this time, when you get near there, you should spot a Charlie and 02 gunships, and maybe you can maintain better communications with 65 once you get near, over. Roger, sir. We're over the area now. We've got the helicopters in sight, and is this Dutch Master is working down here? Pony aircraft is 17. Can say call sign, please? This is Pony 36. 36 is 17. Roger. I got Dutch Master's home plate on Lima. They're going to try and get them up this push. Roger, sir. Pony 4, go back, button 11. Right. Just copy, and I'll be at the stop. Your shot, the other guy calls it beautiful. Thought it was a full sign.
From the 14th to the 21st, for 168 continuous hours, Black Ponies scrambled 110 missions in support of ARVN units and their American advisors, who had been in almost continual contact with the Z8 and Z9 battalions of the NVA 95A Regiment and BC main forces in Anjouan, Chongtian, and Xinjiang provinces. Here is how one Black Pony recalled those scrambles at the time. Starting with the blast of the scramble horn, I stagger out of the bunker and into the early morning light of the cockpit, shaking sleep from my brain as I try to comprehend numbers, map coordinates, frequencies, call signs, when moments before, all I had to focus on was the inside of my eyelids as I dreamed of my wife, my daughter, loved ones, playing baseball, going to the movies on Saturday night. But reality has yanked me back to the war, the thrash around the cockpit. Gotta get this damn thing started. Turning number 1, the backseater jumps in. Turning 2, power levers back to get the props off the blocks. CYN-3 Fox, the plane captain, frantically pulling the chocks, and the bird lurches forward and on out to the arming area, hands up in the air to signal the ordnancemen it's okay to pull the safety pins and arm the rockets, as Chief Bostic, AO-1 Sullivan, and the other AOs back carefully away from the spinning props. The aircraft speed down the taxiway to take off on the scramble from which we will return all too soon, to be refueled and rearmed, a hot turnaround, and sent on our way back to come back for more fuel and ordnance, and it's not even daylight yet as AO-1 Carson joins the others to lift the heavy rocket pods up onto the next set of aircraft awaiting the new bunker crew, called to the other side early to relieve these exhausted pilots who pour into the truck. Then Airman Brown drives us back to the BOQ, where we'll sleep about 4 hours, and all the other available pilots in the squadron will have been subjected to the same cycle, and to hell with the 3 combat missions per day rule. Rules? Are we talking about rules here again? And we fall out of our racks when Brown comes knocking on our doors, for it's our turn once more. The hot sun beats down on our sleepy heads while we speed back to the airfield in the back of the pickup truck, also carrying cockpit instruments, fuel controls, and other parts, cannibalized from the Hangar Queen at the short strip, which will not be needed, as all other airworthy birds are flying their tails off, and some not so airworthy, that metalsmiths and electricians and mechanics and avionics technicians work on under the blistering sun because the hangars are crammed with aircraft, some up on jacks as ADJ-1 Dempsey and ADJ-3 Lunsford remove an engine that was shot up this morning, and it's not even close to lunchtime. But no one will see the chow hall for days, and the supply of sea rats is getting low, as are the Zuni rockets, and the AOs are joined now by the pilots to screw on fuses, load ammo belts into sponsons, stuff rockets into pods. How's it going out there, sir? Chief Michael asks. What can I tell the men? As night falls, but the tempo doesn't. The duty officer has long since stopped blowing the scramble horn, since every flight now is a scramble. Flares fight darkness, shadows fight flares, darkness fights us all. The outpost is being attacked again. Hurry, Black Pony. Men are dying, a constant shuttle of aircraft to and from the U-men, and pilots to and from the airfield. Fatigue building in man and machine, in and around the hangars, men everywhere, as every available wrench, hammer, and tool is turned, swung or twisted. AMS-2 gauze, AMS-2 ray, and other metalsmiths, patching bullet holes. Read you 5 by what? Read you 5 square. AT-1 Elliott, trying to listen to the Fox mic radio he is repairing while being blasted by the prop wash and the roar of the engine, that ADJ-2 Scott is running up nearby as he tweaks and adjusts the rigging. It's almost dawn and no one can think of sleep, food, or anything except the job at hand. Fingers smashed, knuckles bruised, muscles pulled as yeomen and hospital corpsmen are pressed into service, loading ordnance in a pre-dawn thunderstorm. The dust and the grime now flow as mud mixes with sweat, oil, jet fuel, and hydraulic fluid. Yellow, red, purple sunrise, steam rising from the PSP, along with the temperature and the tempers as the day begins anew, yet stale with the events of yesterday and the day before, in one long, continuous blur of pilot and a plane captain in a hurried discussion about the mission, each reading the fatigue on each other's face, not sure if they've just said the same thing to each other only hours before. How's it going out there, sir, as an aircraft comes back with no pods, having dropped them into the Bossack after losing an engine? Give me a damn break. More frigging rocket pods to lift. Sweat, oil, fuel, blood. Okay, stand a brief, guys. Meet you in the arming area. Hands up again. Taxi for takeoff. Never get above 3,000 feet. No cool air. No time to waste. No rest for the wicked. No screw-ups now. No, this can't be. I was here just a few hours ago, wasn't it? Or was that yesterday? Tracers fill the sky. Off left. Urgh, Raj, I'm in hot. Fly by the seat of the pants. Good job, Black Pony. Send me more. Hot refuel and rearm and back to the target again. Men are dying and back again. Then in the rack to dream it all over again as another day turns into another night and another day dawns. And then silence. The radios are eerily silent. The scrambles finally stop. The sun sets. Rest arrives. Darkness. Life went back to normal for the Black Ponies, however normal war in the Delta could be. For the ponies, that meant a routine of flying combat missions, collateral duties, and whatever way you could relax. For some, it meant games like AC-doocy, or volleyball, or racquetball, or fishing, or, would you believe, swimming, or kayaking, or just hanging out. For others, it meant playing with pets, or maybe watching an air show. For some, relaxation meant going into town, Ben Samoy or Canto, or volunteering at the Providence Orphanage. Much of the orphanage's building materials, playground equipment, clothes, and medicine was cumshawed by the Black Ponies. Cumshaw was not just a necessity for this Navy squadron, dropped as it was into the middle of the Mekong Delta with few resources, but lots of ingenuity.
But I guess I did have a reputation, a bit of a cumshaw artist who horse traded for a few things and tried to help the squadron live a little better.
And I got a couple of
Okay, I'll back out. I'll back out here.
This about that. This guy, John Butterfield, was the only guy I know that could start off with a combat watch in the morning and end up with a truck at night. And in between time were flight jackets and jeeps and all that stuff. I don't know how he did it. And John and I worked together at Bang Tao. And I remember asking him, how did you get whatever this thing was? And John said, don't ask questions. So I just did it. Use it. Yeah.
From the very first JO Jeep acquired by Larry Hone and Charlie Fail, and air conditioners by T.Y. Baker and Mike Wolf, to Charlie Moore's secret JO phone line, Cumshaw, as practiced by Black Ponies, was an art form. The squadron possessed about 12.5 vehicles, few officially assigned to it. Every few months, they had to explain where they came from. Then they had to be even more ingenious. Mike Lamberto traded trinkets for steaks and steaks for plywood for the enlisted men's barracks. Max Britton flew air cover for some guys who drove a newly acquired Jeep all the way from Saigon. No one ever asked Max what he would have done if the guys had gotten caught on the road back to Binh. The skipper drove a Holden, an Australian version of a Plymouth Valiant, assembled by aircraft mechanics and metalsmiths from thousands of bartered, bought, and stolen parts, painted black with a red insignia and Black Pony on the doors. Pilots dubbed it the Ponymobile. Ponies traded an aircraft engine to the Air Force in exchange for a car engine for the skipper's Ponymobile. Max brought the engine for the car back from Bung Tau in the back of an OV-10 and got a surprise when the loose engine shifted on liftoff. Bubba Seegers exchanged an air conditioner for a Jeep, which he swapped for a helicopter, which he traded for a U-6 Beaver, an old radial engine tail-dragger plane that he hid at the Army helo field. Hoping to use it for recreation, Bubba got caught when squadron fuel reports showed the use of avgas. Some rear echelon type figured out the OV-10 burned jet fuel. Commander Jim Burton got a bit too cavalier one day and pilfered a bunch of plywood from a Vietnamese Air Force general right from under his nose and had to build overnight a regulation-sized four-wall handball court in one of the hangars to hide the evidence. In the U-Men battle, the Black Ponies had found the fight they were looking for. It turned out to be not only a chance to work closely with troops on the ground in a significant operation, but also a demonstration that with the use of their aircraft, weapons, and skills, Black Ponies could save lives with close air support in a sustained ground assault. On September 23rd, Senior American Advisor to the 21st Division, Colonel Ross Franklin, sent a letter to the VAL-4 commanding officer which he requested be given to all Black Ponies and incorporated into their military records. Franklin wrote, "By providing close air support, sometimes to within 25 meters of assaulting troops, as well as accurate support at night, the Ponies on several occasions permitted ARVN troops to overrun NVA positions before the enemy could withdraw or recover his weapons. As a result, at least 5 enemy battalions were decimated and over 200 weapons captured. In over 27 months with U.S. and ARVN combat units, to include service in all 4 core areas, I know of no more professional, dedicated, or effective combat aviation unit in any service than the Black Ponies. You should all be proud of the enviable reputation you have with the 21st ARVN Division and the essential role you have played in the U-Men campaign. I have noted that with ARVN commanders at all levels, if they know only 2 words in English, those words are Black Pony." Before the year ended, the Black Pony's last XO, Commander Ron Pickett, reported aboard, along with pilots Harry Ginser, Dave Church, Ed Woods, Steve Josephson, Dale Ware, Nick Haroon, Lance Mayhew, Jim Cullen, Pete Black, and joining the maintenance department, Bob Pastry and Jeff Widman. The Black Ponies added several new missions in 1972. The Nogs, Night Observation Gunship, a detachment of 2 Marine Corps YOB-10 Deltas joined the Black Ponies for 10 weeks, flying night missions utilizing the forward-looking infrared radar. Ponies also flew single-ship naval gunfire missions along both coasts of the Delta, with a Marine 1st Anglico air observer in the rear seat, spotting and directing naval gunfire on inland targets. Pre-planned airstrikes fragged by the Delta Regional Assistance Command in Canto tasked Black Ponies to drop CBU-55 fuel-air explosive bombs to clear areas of booby traps, mines, bunkers, and enemy personnel. VAL-4 was the first squadron to drop this weapon. Black Ponies flew a new single-ship mission Visual Airborne Reconnaissance Surveillance, or VARS for short, which helped maritime forces keep track of boat activity along the coast from Ha Tien to Vung Tau. From September the 8th to April the 10th, 1972, VAL-4 flew 225 VARS missions with observers from CTF 116 in the back seat. After completing these armed single-ship missions, Black Pony pilots would often join up with a fire team to find a ball game. On one such occasion, on October 29th, the VARS crew spotted an enemy anti-aircraft gun emplacement on the coast of Vinh Binh province, and after rendezvousing with a fire team, attacked the target. Lieutenant Bubba Seegers and his observer, Lieutenant Ed Smith, ejected from their OV-10 when it was brought down by enemy ground fire. On the ground for 33 minutes, they evaded and escaped capture, and in a daring rescue, the wounded men were picked up by an Army helo. The last replacement pilots joined the Black Ponies in January 1972. Bob Lutz, Mike Parks, Dennis Gillerin, Larry Brown, Mel Etheridge, and Chuck Carlin. Despite rumors of the squadron being disestablished, flight operations continued at a hectic tempo. Intelligence sources predicted an enemy offensive during the upcoming Tet holidays. Bob Lutz was killed in action and his backseat observer was wounded when their aircraft went down near the mouth of the Songandak River on February 9th. Except for the increased enemy activity in the Mekong Delta, and despite the ominous intelligence reports and memories of the 1968 Tet Offensive, the massive nationwide offensive predicted during the Tet holidays never materialized. In late March, Ponies flew numerous scrambles in support of the 21st ARVN Division, who were in heavy contact with the enemy. Several VAL-4 aircraft received extensive battle damage from intense anti-aircraft fire, including one flown by Nick Haroon, whose controls were blown away. Streaming fuel and flying the Bronco by trim tabs, the pilot managed to land the plane at Tan Son Nhut, where the Bronco was struck from the inventory. His wingman's Bronco was also badly damaged. On the 30th of March, the Thursday before Easter, the Communists launched a major offensive across the DMZ, through Laos and into the Central Highlands, and through Cambodia into the area above Saigon. The United States had withdrawn so many units from Vietnam during the last few months that only 70,000 Americans remained, less than 6,000 of whom were combat troops. VAL-4 flew its last combat mission on March the 31st, appropriately in support of the 21st ARVN Division. Just a few weeks later, the 21st would be sent to An Loc to help break the siege that ominously foreshadowed the fall of the Republic of South Vietnam 3 years later. The last Black Pony skipper, Bob Porter, recalled his many months in command more than 25 years later.
Well, it can be all summed up, I guess, for me personally. It's a come true to be commanding officer of that squadron. Every naval aviator, a career naval aviator, looking toward command is the ultimate goal. And to have a combat command, I think, is even a greater honor. You know, I was very fortunate to get for command of that squadron. However, I was always disappointed during and even afterward that there was not more recognition given to the enlisted men. Because I really feel that of all the squadrons I've ever in, that the men of the VAL-4 command are probably the best performing that I've seen. And I mean from the maintenance, the ordnance, to the line crews, to the suppliers, to the administration personnel. Now, looking back at my records and the thoughts that I had when I made my end of tour report, and it was amazing that we never lost a mission due to a maintenance or ordnance malfunction. We never had a operational loss or even anywhere near it as far as maintenance or ordnance malfunction. And that's a pretty wonderful record, to say the least.
April 1st, the Black Ponies stood down. Light Attack Squadron 4 would earn numerous individual and unit awards, including the Presidential Unit Citation. In its short history, VAL-4 flew more than 21,000 combat sorties, amassing more than 42,000 flights, a Navy record for fixed-wing aircraft. By any standard of achievement, VAL-4 set the record for Navy squadrons during the Vietnam War in its ability to destroy the enemy on the ground. But more than anything else, the Black Ponies demonstrated how close air support could and should be used to save the lives of U.S. and Allied ground troops and riverine forces. When the Black Ponies were decommissioned on April the 10th, 1972, a significant chapter in naval history came to a close.